He literally reinvents both the way that he writes the piece, like the methodology he uses to write it, and also just the sound of it. He reinvents it in every single piece that he writes. I just premiered a new piece of his last summer, and that piece, of course, shared some things with his older music. I could tell it was Andy, but he did things in that piece I've never seen him do before. So in that way, I can't predict it. And in terms of like, if I close my eyes and imagine what this quintet would sound like, I'm sure I could point out a few rhythmic or harmonic things that he might do just because I know he loves those sorts of things. But I also know there are things that I can't think of, and that's because he's Andy. That's the whole point. Andy is an amazing steel drum player, an incredible performer. It's a big part of his life. And every time he comes and watches us play Seven Pillars, he wishes that he was on stage playing with us.
But Bernstein, for me, this was amazing to be able to see him because I grew up watching the Young People's concerts. And to be able to actually see him conduct was a mesmerizing experience. Morris Janssen said about, Morris adored Bernstein. He absolutely adored him. He said, well, you know, you might go to a concert and you would say, when Bernstein conducted, well, this is not the way the music's supposed to go. And Morris said, who cares? It's an event. Bernstein made every concert an event. I think for the most part he was right on the money in terms of his musical thoughts, but it's true, every concert with him was electrifying. Up there with him, but much less frequent a performer, was Carlos Kleiber. I saw Carlos Kleiber conduct Traviata and Otello at the Met, the latter with Placido Domingo. The thing that was amazing about Kleiber, first of all, he had unbelievable control over all forces.
And I conducted, among other things, the Candide Overture and Glitter and Be Gay and Music from West Side Story and this and that in front of Bernstein. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from Harry Kraut, who was Bernstein's manager at the time. And Harry said, Lucas, you should apply to the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival. And I said, what's that? And he said, Lucas, you should apply to the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival. I said, okay. So I received a round-trip ticket to Germany, and in the summer of 19 was off to Salzau, Germany, where I was one of 16 conductors and then pared down to one of four conducting fellows chosen to go on tour conducting in concert with Leonard Bernstein, doing concerts around Germany.
But as a musical entity at that moment, it was unfettered energy and love in the musical moment, and that left even as a kid, left an enormous impression on me. And when I was at the Curtis Institute, he came and conducted a couple of times. That was the only time I played under him, and I was already studying conducting, and I was mesmerized by the control. After all the histrionics were set aside and everything, his sheer control of the orchestra, his ability to understand what was happening and to merge the whole into one single breath was pretty amazing.
I got special permission from the Bernstein family to utilize as inspiration the quote of Bernstein from his speech that he made to the United Jewish Fund after JFK was assassinated, in which he spoke about, what do we do? What can we possibly do as artists in the face of tragedy? And he said, this will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before.
But he and Lenny had a friendship which went back to their, they were not kids, but they were close, And I think of now when I conduct the Bernstein Serenade, the violin and orchestra piece, which is a wonderful piece, arguably one of his, if not his strongest purely instrumental piece, which my father did the world premiere of in Venice. And I think about that, and there's this wonderful letter that Lenny wrote to him the night before, after the dress rehearsal, and just sort of slipped it under his door at the hotel. And I think about that, these two guys, they were, early 30s, and just crossing the world with these 10-league boots and making this kind of music.
The fact that Aaron Copland took the time to write to a 6-year-old boy in the San Fernando Valley across the country was truly extraordinary and something that has stayed with me my whole life. I did have a chance to meet him 10 years later when I was a student at Tanglewood, when I was 16.
Most of the kinds of changes I had to make were revoicing. In the case of John Coriano, he was actually terrified of the guitar and kept postponing the process of starting the piece, even though I gave him scores to study recording, even a manual, a mock guitar fingerboard out of cardboard, and then I lent him a guitar, which he put under the piano and then hid in the closet because it scared him to look at.
But we worked so hard. He's the only guy I ever played with that gave me a little bit of arm trouble, where my arms started to get tired, and I was worried about getting tendonitis or something. He worked us so hard. We got great results, but the first couple of concerts were always a little bit below what we could have done because we were just overworked. But he's a brilliant, brilliant conductor. I always loved playing with him. He became like another father to me, and we remained very, very close until his death 20 years ago. So I really credit him for getting me past the point. There's always a point where you have talent, or you have facility, or you have some kind of ability, and then you get to this plateau area where you could either remain there for a long time, and that is where you end up, or somebody pushes you past that threshold. And Mr. Gingold challenged me to constantly go beyond that, and that is where my success came from. Really, is his vision and his guidance in trying to get me way beyond what I was comfortable with. And I think that's where I owe my success to, is his ability to motivate me and teach me to motivate myself, and that was essential.
I had the opportunity to see Heinz Holliger, the wonderful oboe player, composer, conductor. He was the guest conductor for the evening, and I remember how I really loved his music, and so I went to talk to him backstage, and he was kind enough to receive this ignorant 20-something-year-old, and I showed him a couple of my compositions, and he was so kind to give me a lot of his time there backstage when a lot of friends were waiting for him, and he was generous to offer me his time. So these experiences were so inspiring when somebody you've just experienced, at the top of the profession are generous enough to offer you their time. So this is the kind of experience that to me was so very, very eye-opening.
And you play with Manfred, it feels like a new piece every time you play it. It's great. That's his gift. He makes retreaded music. He makes it sound like it's brand new, like you've never heard it that way. It's so fresh. It's so unusual. There are so few artists that do that, He really doesn't have a particular forte because he does everything very, very well. His Dvorak symphonies are fabulous. His Strauss is fabulous. His Beethoven is fabulous. Mozart is fabulous. Schubert. He does all of this. The traditional Austro-German repertoire he does fabulously. But he also does a lot of other stuff fabulously. And that's unusual today. I think that's why so many orchestras really like him. They like his versatility. They like his intricate thinking. And he really takes a lot of care with everything. And he's a very calm and determined musician. I think people can misunderstand him and think he's just a nice, calm man. He does not give up until he gets what he wants. And it means every detail is important to him. He'll do it in a calm, polite way, but boy, he's relentless. He just won't give up.
But he works really, really hard and takes every minute of rehearsal, even if it's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You're going to do it again to get every nuance right and the way he wants to do it. And then he might do it a little differently when you actually perform it, but he takes every minute of rehearsal. So the orchestra really works hard with him. But I've heard only good things. He gets up very early, goes to Mass, then he comes to QED FM to preview the concert. I think he's been the most extraordinarily generous in terms of his personal time and involvement with the radio series. They've all been great, but Manfred's really made that an agenda item to connect with as many people as he can through broadcasting. He's very loose and free about what he says. He always has something insightful and heartfelt to say about the music and also what he's doing.
I also have to say Marius Jansons is one of my idols musically. He's somebody that I've come to admire because as a conductor, it seems that there's nothing he can't do. Remember, I mean, all of us have our strengths and our weaknesses. I mean, there's repertoire that we do incredibly well. There's other repertoire that we do okay, but that's normal. I mean, that's what you expect from a human being. I mean, we have strengths and weaknesses, and as a music director, you have to do everything. But in my many years of watching and following Marius, everything I've seen him do, it's always remarkable.
One other great Morris story, the very first concert he did with them as music director was the Mahler Fifth for their opening concerts. And for the dress rehearsal, not the dress rehearsal, the very first rehearsal, Morris allowed them to play the piece from start to finish with absolutely no comments, no starting or stopping, because he knew the musicians were anxious to play for him, and he was going to let them do that. Then they went to work after that. But he was such a good psychologist. He really knew how to relate to musicians and how to get the best out of them.
He didn't understand if the Verdi Requiem was an immediate sellout or the Brahms Requiem. That didn't make sense to him. And in Europe, those were pieces that were box office hits. In America, he had to do some help with getting bodies and seats. And so I think that was a challenge for him. But he loved being here. The orchestra loved him. I had a chance to go back and see him at the Concertgebouw on a couple of occasions after he left Pittsburgh, and he just couldn't have been warmer and more generous. The same as we found him every time we did an interview with him. Again, he was here on many occasions. We hauled the equipment down to Heinz Hall to record dozens and dozens of interviews with him over the years that he was here.
And I will never forget the last performance that we did on our final tour with Morris in Royal Albert Hall, 2 evenings. The first one culminating in Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, and then the second night was Mahler 1. And I had never heard the orchestra play. I mean, it was absolutely brilliant to the smallest hemi, demi, semi-quiver. I mean, just whatever. It was extraordinary, the sound. And there were several members of the orchestra who were retiring after the tour, so it was very heartfelt, because this was the last time that this orchestra would sound like this with this music director in this hall, and one of those once in a lifetime kind of things. A lot of things happened on tour. Extraordinary opportunity. We were doing the Mozart Requiem in Carnegie Hall, and I had the opportunity to sit next to Elie Wiesel, who was a guest of Morris, and I brought him backstage after the Requiem. It was things that would never have happened if I stayed in LA. As much as I love film scores, and I still continue to do work in the studios, having that depth of world experience was something that could only have happened with that move to Pittsburgh.
Then, when I was working in North Carolina, the Bavarian Radio Symphony came and played in Chapel Hill. Kavakos played the Korngold Violin Concerto, and then the second half was Mahler 5. And Marius Jansons conducted, and it was the greatest concert I've ever heard. And I wrote a long journal entry. I actually typed it on my computer. How is this possible? This kind of sound. And
we loved playing for him, and so we had a lot of success with him. We played all over the world with him, particularly in Vienna. They loved him there, and he has a close association with Vienna, and we had a great time with him. It was a sad day when he decided to leave. Very interesting about Jansons. The most interesting thing to me about him is that he's Latvian by birth, and he has such a strong connection with Vienna that he almost comes across as a Austro-Germanic style that is not really that Russian-oriented in many ways. He does the Russian repertoire fabulously, but as we were talking about earlier, he could do Strauss waltzes, he could do Rosenkavalier, he could do that kind of repertoire. I mean, he had no peer when it came to this kind of repertoire. It was fascinating to see that.
what an unbelievable career before he ever got to Cleveland or the Vienna State Opera, and then coming to Pittsburgh, where he spent the better part of a decade. Unbelievable guy. I saw how much he loved his parents, his mother and his father. He was very devoted to them. His father lived with him at the Castleton Festival, his home in suburban Virginia there at the last years of his life. To get the full picture of Lorin Maazel, you need to meet his mother and his father. I did an extensive series of interviews about their relationship with Lorin over the years, and whether they'd pushed him as a prodigy, and all the kinds of questions you might ask mom and dad of somebody so amazing as Maazel. And it gave me, I think, a much more fuller, rounder picture. Lorin loved the press. Was very smart, I think, about speaking to the press. You may remember one of his big events with the New York Philharmonic going to Korea. It was very controversial to go to North Korea, but he just had a sense of what made an event. He conducted all the 9 Beethoven symphonies in one day on several occasions, and did a huge event here at the Civic Arena in downtown Pittsburgh with a gigantic choir and orchestra, and it was generally headline grabbing for good reasons, always, I think.
I sent a batch of hot peppers to him via the Kennedy Center, and then I got a chance to meet him backstage in the green room after the concert, and told him I was that person, and he sent me a couple of albums, or he had his people send me a couple of albums. So I was the big man on campus. I got this package from Zubin Mehta,
Well, what he told me is that I had to find a sense of authority. And it wasn't as if I had this right to have authority. He helped me see, and this was psychologically, I think, very important, that it was my duty to have authority, that I was letting the orchestra down if I didn't have authority. Because the orchestra, as a group of 100 people, needed that. They needed to feel that the person not was brutal or cruel or overbearing, but that the person had a sense of authority to enable them to play. And I think once I was able to make that shift, that it wasn't like I'm number one, because I didn't feel comfortable with that. It was that I've got to do this, and I have to find a way to have people trust me, and have people, able to come into my perception of this. In terms of little details, I mean, he would say even my language as a woman was undercutting my authority. And the two of them were very different in that George was amazingly gifted at seeing people's physical conducting issues, their problems, what wasn't working, why the orchestra was not able to play together or with a certain kind of sound. He was wonderful at analyzing that. He was wonderful in analyzing how my upbringing as a young girl could impede my authority on the podium. And he was constantly pointing that out to me. And it would really upset me, and we laugh at this now because I'm very close friends with George. But I needed to hear these things over and over. Sixten Ehrling, on the other hand, only studied scores with me. But I remember going to his apartment in New York and bringing my score, and 3 hours later coming out of his apartment having studied Miraculous Mandarin or Rite of Spring. I mean, he loved big orchestral pieces, and feeling like I had learned a million things in that time.
I got to do a seminar with him at Carnegie Mellon, and also got to ask him about Shostakovich and what it was like to work with him. And when one of the Challenger disasters, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember which one, took place, Rostropovich decided that he wanted to play a movement from one of the Bach cello suites. And so they said, well, he doesn't want to go out and talk to the audience, so you'll go out with Rostropovich and you'll explain to the audience what's going on. And I did that, and then I said there would be a moment of silence, and as the moment of silence took place, Rostropovich took my hand and grabbed it. So I'm standing on stage with Rostropovich, with him and his cello, and I'm thinking, how on earth have I been blessed enough to be in this position? So my mind boggles every time I think about it.
Well, my first professional job was the assistant to Rostropovich in Washington, where I was for 6 years. Learned a tremendous amount from him, especially Russian repertoire and a kind of all-encompassing passion for being a musician and being a performer, a kind of life lesson in how almost obsessive he was, all-consuming as a musician. He played cello virtually to the end of his life. I would say for the last couple of decades. Once he became a full-time serious conductor, he probably conducted 2/3 of the time and played cello 1/3 of the time, but he was always tremendously in demand as a cellist. And one of the things that was most valuable to us as his assistants, myself and the other assistants of that era, was that he would play the cello with the orchestra and we would conduct. So we learned the entire cello repertoire. He soloed with his own orchestra almost every year, sometimes repeatedly, and at his birthday celebrations when he turned 60, he did these mammoth concerts, series of concerts where he did like 9 concertos in 4 nights. And the assistants tended to be the conductors rather than hiring a guest conductor. And accompanying him was another kind of a life lesson. I mean, he was an amazing artist with an incredibly powerful personality.
One thing that really helped me through this kind of compositional crisis was some advice that Chris Rouse gave to me once when I was at Juilliard, saying to me that very often at some point, you know, in one's 30s, early 30s, composers go through this period, this kind of crisis where you just don't know what the next stage is. You don't, there's a lot of uncertainty in what one does. And I remember him saying to me, you know, the key to keep remembering is you just have to work through it. And remember, we've all been through it, just keep working through it. And, you know, what'll emerge is the next stage of your development. I wasn't expecting him to start sharing some of this, but this ended up being pivotal, I think, in helping me continue to compose.
Obviously, my teacher at Curtis, Max Rudolph, still looms very large in my thinking. He was an extraordinary man, a great thinker, in love with music. He knew everything. And by the time I met him, he was a benevolent grandfather who had conducted everything, you know, had survived Europe in the 30s and was at the Met and had taken Cincinnati from, you know, a kind of mediocre orchestra to an orchestra that traveled the world and had survived a stroke.
Sir George Solti coming to conduct Leningrad Philharmonic, and then I have seen from him that if you really believe in what you do and you're doing right things, you can overcome initial skepticism of the orchestra about the way how the music should be played. And he was a really tough man. And the orchestra was a bit concerned about the way of the music as he suggested, especially because he did a program of Beethoven and it was never a strong side of Leningrad Philharmonic. But then on the dress rehearsal, because they had no choice, they tried the way he suggested, in the bowing, in articulation, in technical aspects, and actually you can see how the orchestra see, oh, it actually works. And then in the concert, it was one of the best concerts I've seen from the Leningrad Philharmonic playing that repertoire. And he gave me an advice which I think is a treasure, and it's something what I will always keep in my mind, I believe. And what I didn't understand by then, 18 years old, I couldn't get it. He said to me, I wish you that music always will be your hobby. And he's absolutely right. You have to love what you do. Once it became money-making, you lose it.
But go back and listen to his recordings of the Beethoven symphonies or the Brahms symphonies with Pittsburgh, and they are knockout, rip-roaring performances. I mean, he wasn't demonstrative on stage, but his music making was very thrilling.
And one thing he said about Zell was that Zell always left his best performances at the dress rehearsal. And, you know, he would just work and work and work and get everything so finely tuned. And he'd exhaust the players by the time they got to the dress rehearsal. They played everything they could. Then the concert was a notch lower. He has great ears, just fabulous ears. It was a piece by Dutilleux, I can't remember the name of it. And we did some wonderful Hindemith that nobody ever plays. He did it brilliantly. Did a Scheherazade with him that was wonderful. Wonderful colorist. We did a Hariano's suite by Kodai, which is rarely played nowadays. Beautiful with him, just great. He has a great sense of color and balance, and he makes people do unusual things with their instruments, and it was really great. We did a wonderful, the best Franck D minor symphony ever was with Totellier. Wonderful. That's a deadly piece. You know, it was done very poorly by almost everyone. He did it brilliantly. He actually made that piece a great work.
I thought the movie was great, and I thought the inversion kept everyone's interest. It's like, how is she going to respond to this? How is this, as she even describes, you know, I'm just a typical U-Haul lesbian. Like, how does someone with those qualifications, you know, deal with the pressures of power? And yeah, I mean, ultimately the takeaway is that power corrupts and it's not a gendered thing.